what's on your playlist right now?
In my class.
Go to guilty pleasure food.
Ice cream.
Ice cream. Hey, Aggies. This week, UC Davis is hosting the Phase 2 Launch Summit of the National Commission on Innovation Competitiveness Frontiers, where some of the nation's key leaders from business, labor, government, and academics have come together to focus on our nation's innovation and competitiveness in the global economy. Today, for this special edition of Face to Face, I'm joined by Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs of the United States, Jed Kolko, and President and CEO of the United States Council on Competitiveness, Deborah Wince-Smith. Jed, Deborah, thanks for being here with me today on Face to Face. Welcome to UC Davis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I typically in these sessions, we ask questions. I interview the guests. But today I'd rather just the three of us have a conversation about some of the issues that we're going to be discussing during the meeting today. Issues around competitiveness in the global marketplace and how universities and businesses team together for innovation. So let me just start by asking, why are you here today? Why UC Davis, Deborah?
Well, we're here at UC Davis because, one, this university has a storied history. You know, it's one of our leading universities in agriculture, animal husbandry. But beyond that, you now have created the capabilities in health, advanced technology across the board. But you also have very innovative models for your partnerships. I mean, we have the Rondavi Wine Institute here, what you've done with your infrastructure, Aggie Square, and very importantly, how you're educating, the next generation of a diverse student body and inclusivity. So you kind of have all the ingredients of a leading university that's changing and developing a great economy here in this part of California and the country.
Thank you. Very nice words. Jed, what made you accept the invitation to come?
The Council on Competitiveness is bringing together leaders across corporate America, academia, government, to really think about how all of us connect in order to foster a culture of innovation. This is work that is not only about government, it's not only about universities, it's about bringing us all together, and that's what we're doing today here at UC Davis.
Absolutely. Thank you. So one of the topics at today's meeting is place-based innovation. And Jed, I know you're going to give a keynote on that topic. Maybe you can tell the audience, what does that mean and what does it mean to you and why is it important?
So when we think about place-based innovation, from the federal government perspective, it tends to mean two things. First is directing investment to particular places for particular reasons. And the second is investments that help narrow some of the geographic gaps, geographic inequalities that persist in this country. So some examples of programs like these are the programs that we have at Commerce, like Internet for All, really bringing broadband access to all those parts of America that are underserved or unserved in terms of broadband access. But it's also identifying places that have unique capacity for innovation in order to fund things like new tech hubs and think about where we can help build up some of our semiconductor manufacturing capability. So all these programs are place-based. And there's really been a shift in how economists and policymakers think about place and take it much more seriously than in the past. So, Deborah, that seems to be right in the wheelhouse of the council, right? So tell us about why we think that's an important topic.
Well, it is, and in fact, it's new language, but it's a back to the future story for the Council on Competitiveness because we were the organization bringing together universities, industry, labor, national labs, who really created the thought, leadership, and action around what was called clusters of innovation. Back in the late 90s, we studied various regions of the country to understand what was it about these regions that enabled them to transform their economies and move into the innovation future. San Diego was one of them. And now, of course, today, we do have more clusters in the country around specific areas of excellence or capability. I mean, we know the culture of Silicon Valley in terms of startups and venture capital. But we've seen, in the last 30, 40 years, continuing hollowing out of our manufacturing base. Yes, a lot of that was 20th 20th century manufacturing, but we really are committed to building up, unleashing the power and potential of all these regions in our country that have really been kind of left behind, and they haven't been part of the innovation transformation. And not only is it an issue of justice and equity, it's a really hardcore economic and national security issue, because we have to have our whole population engaged in this, not just, maybe 10%. But things do occur in places and regions, and it's how we connect them and grow them is really at the heart of place-based innovation.
Yeah, and for so long, over recent decades, especially with the rise of the internet and commercialization of the internet, there was this sort of incorrect belief that place would stop mattering. There was the book, The Death of Distance. There were all these notions that, you could do anything you wanted anywhere. But guess what? Like, everything still happens somewhere. If anything, geographic inequality has gotten worse, not better. It's not that things have spread out more evenly. It's that things have gotten, if anything, more geographically concentrated. So if anything, place has become even more important, despite all these predictions that the internet would make the end of distance would make cities disappear, none of which came to pass.
And of course, the book, the world is flat. The world is not flat at all, as we've seen in many, many ways.
Same predictions happened for higher ed, and the place-based residential university was also thought to be on its way out. We're glad that it's not. Our university is made up of many students, 40,000 of them, and they're a principal part of our audience for face-to-face. Can you talk about the importance of students in pushing innovation and the envelope for innovation and their creativity and their educational experiences?
Well, I think the first thing about students, and this is what's so great about being a student but also a lifelong learner, is yes, they're curious. They haven't had their views of things completely molded. And they also have more risk-taking, perhaps, than older people do in their life journey. And so they are really poised to create whatever the future's going to be. And that is why being in an academic environment is so exciting. Yes, they're learning skills and how to learn and knowledge, but it's also what they're going to do with that when they leave. And a lot of those ideas and pathways germinate while they're students. And so the energy and excitement, I'm sure you know that as chancellor, of engaging with your students all the way up through, advanced researchers is very exciting.
It is. It's one of the reasons I'm in this job. I love being around those students. Any thoughts, Jed, on that topic? Or
Yeah, so many of our ideas come near the start of our careers. And students, of course, will be starting their careers at the cutting edge of whatever field they're in. But I think also we know from lots of economic development research that some of the most profound innovations come from bringing together ideas or best practices from different fields and connecting, what we know from a certain kind of manufacturing with a certain kind of business process from some other area. And the world that students experience is before we all get siloed and split off. Now as an economist, there are days when I spend all day long around other economists, and economists have their charms, but that is not the way to foster innovation. It is when you are around people with ideas from completely different fields and hear about something from outside your narrow discipline or what you know well. That's where so many innovations happen. And that happens in student life when you really are exposed to people thinking about all kinds of different topics. And that's very hard to replicate in the professional world. It is very hard to recreate, that kind of openness and exploration and exposure to lots of different fields that you get in student life.
Yeah, I would agree. Go ahead, Deborah.
I was just going to add that I'm one of the people who thinks the liberal arts education is one of our great strengths, and that it's during those years where you have the opportunity, to, study whatever it is across the liberal arts curriculum, and yes, fuse it and understand, how literature and how history and all these things, really, yes, shape our world, but, past is prologue. And I am concerned that in many universities the specialization occurs too soon, And often that's true in STEM-intensive universities because there's so much to learn. But I will say that as a student, yes, you can become a STEM leader, and you can go back and learn some of these things, whether it's, Shakespeare or whatever it is. But if you don't take some of the STEM courses as an undergraduate, it's very hard to go back. So this concept of STEAM and how we merge that is very, very important. And I think some of these requirements that may seem old-fashioned are very relevant to the future.
Yeah, we're very proud of UC Davis' comprehensive nature. We have more than 100 undergraduate degrees and more than 90 professional and graduate degrees across 4 colleges and 6 professional schools. So students have an opportunity to mix and match the STEM fields and the humanities and social sciences in really creative ways. And many of the students are double majors and majors and minors and all sorts of permutations. So I think that's really, really helpful. I want to switch gears and talk about economic development, which Jed, you mentioned very briefly in your remarks just now. Can we say a few words about the role of the university, government, and organizations like the council in collaborating for economic growth, both in rural and small-town environments like Davis, but also urban environments like Sacramento and other cities where we are active?
Well, I think there are 2 important ways that universities contribute to economic development. I think the one that people probably think of first is around innovation and the development of new discoveries, new techniques, new technologies that then have the potential to be commercialized. But I think the other is that increasingly, as the economy shifts from physical goods to services, and 80% of our economy is about services, not physical goods, innovation happens where people want to live. And universities often create communities that people want to live in. And so even in addition to the activities of universities that contribute to innovation, universities also create the kind of social infrastructure that attracts all kinds of innovators to live there. And so it's both the essentially supporting the productive side of innovation, but also creating the kinds of amenities that people are attracted to is all the ways that universities contribute to innovation, economic development.
Great points. Yeah.
And I would add to that universities in many places are the prime employer of a region. And in that sense, they do have both a responsibility and an opportunity to ensure, if there's a new innovation, whether it's in the use of clean energy or in telecom, that they're a leader in that. And then it also, is in the community. I think of Virginia Tech, in Virginia, how they've done that. And also Georgia Tech. And UC San Diego is a wonderful example because I'm sort of a Navy family. I have 2 sons that went to the Naval Academy and services, but people don't remember how Qualcomm was founded. It's an amazing story, Erwin Jacobs, coming from MIT, he's an engineer. He's playing around out there. He goes for the weather. He gets a little contract with the Navy for a little communication thing offshore, Linkabit, and the rest is history. But you had to have UC San Diego and all that, technology and leadership to take that to scale, and now you have an economy that's biotech, telecom, et cetera, et cetera. I do think also that universities, particularly the large ones, but really across the country, are accepting their responsibility now to be a beacon for hope in their communities. I won't name them, but there's some universities in our country that are very distinguished, and yet the places where they live have never had any socioeconomic advancement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that's serious for our country, because the universities, the colleges are the spirit of a place.
I like that. I like that a lot. The San Diego example is really powerful. I think UC Davis, we consider ourselves among the leaders, world leaders in plant health, animal health, and human health. And we think that's maybe the place where the next great set of discoveries that move the economy and the nation forward might be. What do you think about that assertion? Do you
I believe this back to the point of, the innovation often occurs at the intersection, but it is the conversion. And, now we're on the frontiers of synthetic biology, immunology, just going through the COVID trauma and pandemic, there are going to be more zoomorphic viruses, and understanding that and its relationship to humans, and that's a huge frontier. Unfortunately, not maybe a pleasant one, but you were really taking kind of the core pieces of convergence with many, many applications. I mean, we can't live without food, water, and health. So that's right. Really the trifecta.
Yeah, and these are sectors that I think are a great example of the way that the university both produces but also creates a community that attracts people. Just in my own experience, I lived for about 20 years in San Francisco, often worked in Sacramento, and Davis would often be the place where I would buy food between the farmer's market, the meat lab, and so on. And so it is probably the community where I would most like to be a home cook of any place I've ever been. And so again, it's of course both the science and innovation side, but it spills over to create a community that attracts people and makes it a desirable place to live.
Indeed. You'll be happy to know that the farmers market and the meat lab are still going strong in Davis. So
I think a few of our colleagues went to the farmers market.
Did they?
Yes,
over the weekend?
They knew about it.
Yeah. I want to talk about the future of innovation a little bit. What do you think the society, we as Americans, should be doing, innovators, students, to shape the future of work and healthcare and climate change and all these issues that are facing us, just not the near future and further out? What advice would you give to our community to think about in facing these issues?
Well, one, I think this generation, and maybe again it's a back to the future story of looking back, 40, 50 years, have a real sense of responsibility. They are very concerned about the issues, climate change and others, but they want to have careers of impact. And so the extent of which, universities have that opportunity for them to have co-ops, to, work on projects that have both a social and a technological value, that's going to attract the best and brightest, I think, into these fields. But also, I think a challenge is time. I mean, we talk about the time horizon needing to accelerate, but, big transformations don't always happen overnight, and young people have a little bit of impatience. I know even I still do. So how, you understand that continuum of change and progress. And the other thing that's really exciting today is I do think we're seeing the two bookends of wisdom. Young people and people who are at a different stage either finish their careers at the end, and you need both of those for experience and wisdom and thought. And so having, young students work with some of the more seasoned people is also a good thing, too.
I agree. Jed, what do you think about
I think there are a few important things to support this culture of innovation. One thing that is essential to understanding innovation is it involves some risk. And for us to have innovation, we need a system where people, have the support and security to take risks, whether that means building more housing. So there is affordable housing around places where innovation activity is happening. All of the ways in which life can be precarious, takes away the ability to take risks. And so there's a certain, sort of set of basic infrastructure that we need to support that kind of innovation. I think the other is to remind folks that you don't need to be a scientist to contribute to innovation. You don't need to be an entrepreneur. You don't need to want to found something, and you don't need to have an innovative idea to contribute to innovation. So much of innovation is the translation of ideas into the marketplace, into society, and that work really needs people who are gifted visually and have a way with words and can be able to translate. So to be the person who can translate what scientists are doing to the lawyers who are negotiating deals, that's an incredibly important role in innovation And it is not only the sort of lone genius who is looking to take a risk.
Very important point. There's a space and a role for contributions from everyone in innovation. I agree completely.
Could I add one comment to
Please.
that, Chancellor May? The other thing I think is that often young people want to work in the startup world. As you said, they want to go out with a group of buddies, whatever, and found something. And it's not necessarily at all in tech. I mean, I always say years ago, Starbucks was a great innovator. They somehow got people all over the world to spend, back then, whatever it was, $5 or $6 for a cup of coffee. I mean, that was an innovation. But working often for large-scale successful companies is very much part of the innovation journey as well, because you learn some of the disciplines, the practices, and they're evolving. I mean, they can't function the way they did in the 1950s. And I know that for my career, having been in the government for some of my career, starting at the National Science Foundation, all the things I learned there, I still practice in my life today. And you don't get that in a startup.
I think there's something to be said for learning how a complex organization operates and being a part of that. We have a feature in Face-to-Face which we call the hot seat. So don't be scared. It's just we're going to ask you some questions that we're looking for very short answers, one word, one sentence kind of answers. We ready?
Yeah.
Here we go. What's the most groundbreaking idea you've heard in the last year?
I think it's the incredible accomplishment of the laser fusion energy accomplishment at Lawrence Livermore, and that there is real talk now about having a functional laser inertial fusion plant by 2030. That's one of the greatest discoveries, accomplishments really, in human history.
Agree. Jed?
I think some of the ideas that I've heard this year most excited about have to do with our cities and what they will look like after the pandemic as more people are working remotely, as we have a change in how we're thinking about office space and a need for so much more housing, and some of the innovation around what our cities might look like, how we might use our downtowns, and how we might get around.
That's another good one.
That's
Thank
great.
you. Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. One of the most important innovators of our lifetime, who and why?
I'll say two of them, and they build on others, of course, back to the point of, I would say Jack Kirby and Bob Noyce, because, not all the invention, but the commercialization of the integrated circuit, has created our digital world. And that's why next generation semiconductors and U.S. leadership in it are essential for our future. So that was the foundation of beyond the information age.
You're in my wheelhouse now, so I can't disagree with those choices. Jed, what do you think?
So I think less in terms of innovators and more in terms of innovations, just because most innovations come from efforts of far more people, many of whom names we don't know. I think for me, some of the most profound innovations have been those that have made it possible for women to participate fully in the paid workforce. Labor-saving devices at home, the pill, all these innovations that completely changed the calculation of education, how to balance work, career, family. One of the biggest sociological changes in the U.S. has been the astounding increase of women in the formal paid workforce over recent decades. So I think those have been some of the most transformative innovations that I think about.
I would agree. Mechanisms for building equity. We're not quite there yet, but we are well along the path, much further than we were. Okay, a little more fun. Something new you've learned about Davis since you've been here.
Well, you set me up beautifully. You ready? One of your anthropologists who's working down in Peru has definitively proven through archaeological evidence that in the Paleolithic age, women were also hunters. They were not just gatherers. And so that's and apparently it's just revolutionizing that whole field and our understanding of the role of women. And of course, in Neolithic societies, there was much more egalitarianism. It wasn't until we had complex cities and things we saw this demarcation. So women as hunters, not just gatherers, although we like to gather still.
That's a great discovery made at UC Davis.
So that's a much grander new realization about Davis than I've had since getting here 12 hours ago. Mine was the Davis Co-op, which had not in the past been part of my regular food stops, but will be in the future.
That's a good one, too. What, in your mind, is the next big trend in innovation?
I would say it's the dematerialization, obviously decarbonization, but the work that's underway to remove our reliance on natural resources that are in scarcity. And the example I would use is not fossil fuels. I would use rare earths, critical materials. You know, we are completely dependent, even though we have our own, as is the EU, on the processing in China. I mean, they control 90% of the processing of graphite. We need, beyond lithium, we need synthetic rare earths. And because they're a building block of, again, batteries, everything in this digital world. And so, yes, we're dematerialization, but we still live in a physical world. I really don't want to have my human interactions all in cyberspace. But the materials frontier is huge.
Materials, very important. Thank you. Jed?
I think across innovation, thinking about the impact on the environment and natural assets will become part of innovations across the board. One of the things that we recently announced out of the statistical agencies of the federal government is a long-term plan to start incorporating natural assets, natural capital, into GDP, the most fundamental measure of overall economic activity. And once you start realizing officially the value of nature, that starts to change all of the decisions you make about what to invest in, how to innovate, what counts as economic growth. Right now in our national accounts, when you chop down a tree to build a house, that new house counts, the lost tree doesn't.
That's very important.
And with this long-term innovation in natural capital accounting, we will count both the house and the tree. And I think we will see that more holistic view of the costs and benefits of our actions reflected in what's valued in terms of innovation.
That's fascinating. So you can be a good environmental steward and still contribute to the economy.
And you would include the oceans, of course.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
One last question. This is a little bit personal. What life experience has shaped who you are?
Well, I'm a Bronze Age Aegean archaeologist. And so I studied and live and love the Minoan and Mycenaean world, starting about 1800 before Christ. That's the old language, of course. And it's an incredible period because they were innovators. They completely reshaped the Mediterranean world. They were also conceptual thinkers and artistry. Women had a very powerful role in Minoan culture, but they created value out of intangible assets. So a lot of their wealth came from selling their beautiful pottery. They became a luxury good, and they created a great civilization. And for me, how this influenced me, archaeology is about understanding a culture and civilization with very little information and how you connect the dots, how something unseen with a little bit of evidence enables you to imagine and then understand what really happened. So for competitiveness work, there's no magic bullet. You have to look at all these different systems and how you put them together. So it made me a synthetic thinker.
Great answer. Yeah. How about you, Jed? What shaped
I think one of the things
you?
that shaped me, and this is relevant for this whole event about place-based innovation and investments, is growing up in a place that had an extraordinary sense of itself. I grew up in Rochester, New York, which, the part of the city I grew up in was enough of a small town that I grew up thinking that a car horn was a greeting. Someone passing by to say hi. And Rochester, for decades, had been so dominated by Kodak that also contributed to a place having such a strong sense of itself economically and culturally. And having undergone such change, being tied to the fate of one big company that existed in a very changing field. And so I think that led to really a whole career of my trying to understand why place is important, why things happen where they do and not someplace else, why people move, why people stay put.
It's interesting how you remember those things. The car horn is a greeting of a different type in a different part of New York.
And you know where all those optic engineers went from Kodak?
Many to other startups within Rochester.
Yeah.
Guess
where the best ones went? This is a trick question.
Tell us.
They went out to Livermore to work on NIF.
They're here. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How about that?
They took the best optic engineers in the country to go out and work on the National Ignition Facility.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, these are all great answers. This has been a great conversation, very insightful and enlightening. So I'm sure our audience is appreciating it. So I want to thank you both, Deborah and Jed, for joining me today on Face to Face. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you for your leadership.
I appreciate that. And Aggies, that's it for Face to Face this month. We'll see you next month. Go Ags.